The lame duck session is over and a new regular session has begun. It's Friday, January 10th. From Capital News, Illinois, I'm Peter Hancock, and this is Capital Cast. If you've spent the last week shoveling out from the snow like people in much of Illinois, you might have missed what was happening at the State House in Springfield. From last Saturday through Tuesday, lawmakers held what's called a lame duck session, one last chance to pass bills that hadn't been resolved during the 103rd General Assembly before the new legislature was sworn in and a new session began. In 4 days, lawmakers passed 24 bills that will now head to Governor J.B. Pritzker's desk. Those include new protections for domestic violence victims, a slimmed-down bill aimed at helping boost the state's renewable energy industry, and a 1,500-acre land transfer to a Native American tribe. The lame duck session was then followed by Inauguration Day on Wednesday, January 8th, marking the start of the 104th General Assembly, not to mention the grand reopening of the ornate Senate chamber in the State House, which has been under renovation for the last 2 years. Here to talk about some of what happened are my colleagues Ben Szalinski and Andrew Adams. Guys, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Peter.
Good to be back.
And also with us today are Bridgette Fox and Jade Aubrey, our interns for the next few months from our education partner at the University of Illinois Springfield Public Affairs Reporting Program. Bridgette and Jade, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
So, Ben, one of the highlights of the session was passage of a thing called Karina's Law, which has to do with protecting victims of domestic abuse. What can you tell us about that? What's going on here?
Yeah, this bill is named after a Chicago woman who was shot and killed by her estranged husband on 4th of July weekend 2023. Karina Gonzalez, she had filed for an order of protection that she received just 2 weeks before she was killed. Essentially, what that order of protection did is it caused her husband's gun owner identification card to be revoked, but law enforcement never actually removed guns from his possession because state law was kind of unclear on how that would happen. So what this bill does is it really closes that loophole to create a specific process for law enforcement to remove guns from people who receive an order of protection against them. People who file in court for an order of protection can seek a firearm remedy, and that is what's going to allow law enforcement to actually take those guns out of somebody's hands. Now, this does go through the court process, so the person who is seeking this order of protection or the local state's attorney will have to file for a search warrant, ask a judge to approve that search warrant to actually allow the police to go and take that gun. But the people behind this bill say this is a really critical tool to curbing gun violence deaths and really removing a dangerous tool from these domestic violence situations, which can often turn deadly.
Okay, and we all know domestic violence situations do turn deadly. But whenever you talk about taking away somebody's guns or taking away their right to own guns, it gets very controversial, and people start talking about Second Amendment rights. So, what's the fallout for this bill? What were the arguments against it from the gun rights segment?
Yeah, essentially, a lot of people on that side are worried that this bill kind of goes around due process in court because orders of protection are filed in civil court. So there's not really a criminal element to this yet. There's not a person who's being charged with a crime. And yet, under this law, a person who has this civil order against them can have their guns taken away. And what the gun lobbyists are saying is that this is basically taking away somebody's constitutional Second Amendment right without any sort of court process, without any sort of arguments, without really proving that a person is an actual threat. They're essentially arguing that unless somebody's actually guilty of a crime, which we know is if somebody's convicted of a crime, then they do lose their Second Amendment right to bear arms. But without that, they're saying that this is going around any sort of due process and is taking away a right without any convictions. And that was a big problem for some Republicans. But I should note that this bill did get bipartisan support from some more moderate Republicans in the legislature.
So, what are the chances we're going to see litigation around this?
It's certainly possible. It was threatened by Republicans in debate and, other folks from the State Rifle Association, for example. But I think it's really important to note here that this was litigated in the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2024. And back in June, the court ruled that a federal law that essentially does a very similar thing is completely constitutional. So it would be a very uphill challenge to actually challenge this law on constitutional grounds, given the U.S. Supreme Court has already made a decision on this.
Okay. I want to turn now to Andrew Adams. Andrew, we have talked a couple of times, I think, on this program about the status of the state's renewable energy industry and talk about major energy legislation perhaps coming up in the General Assembly. That's not exactly what happened during the lame duck session. We saw some kind of trimmed down legislation. One should refresh our memory about what this issue is all about and what finally got through the lame duck session.
Absolutely. So last month, we published a story about the state's energy grid. And in that story, we found that a lot of state officials, current and former, and people who watch the energy industry are growing concerned about the state of, where we get electricity. There's increasing concern that as fossil fuel plants come offline and demand increases because of things like data centers and electric vehicles, that we will not have the supply of electricity at times of high demand in the coming years. So there was a lot of talk in December and into the lead up to lame duck session about some kind of energy package, some kind of omnibus bill that would contain a bunch of different fixes to the energy system to try and make sure that energy is reliable and affordable, as supply and demand rules dictate. If there's lower supply, price is going to go up. But that's not quite where things landed. I talked to several people involved in passing a small piece of legislation during lame duck that said it was a skinny bill. A couple people said it even got skinnier every day they negotiated it. Several important provisions were cut down even on Sunday. So the thing that actually passed ended up being pretty small. It offers some incremental fixes to how the state funds renewable energy, and the state agency that buys energy was pretty pleased with how that shook out, although they say that there is more discussion to be had. And it also sets up a workshop, basically a study of how the state might regulate battery storage and incentivize that, which proponents of solar energy really like, and they say that it would help that technology be more reliable. That report is due to the General Assembly at the start of May, and I'm told it will be the basis of some more legislation coming in the spring.
Okay, and you talk about more legislation coming in the spring. Is this when we're going to see, the big omnibus energy bill, and what other things might they be looking at for that kind of legislation?
It definitely could be a big, sweeping kind of reform-oriented package. Although one advocate pointed out to me that in the history of all these big reform packages, the most recent being the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in 2021, no one can remember a time they passed a big energy package during a legislative session. It usually comes in a lame duck or a veto session or a special session. So it would be kind of a break from tradition if they get something big through this spring, although people are optimistic that a bill dealing with battery storage, dealing with energy efficiency programs, particularly downstate where, those incentives and subsidies have been kind of less than they are in the Chicago area, and a couple other fixes to how we fund renewable energy that didn't make it into this package from last week. So that's what could be on the agenda. It'll be interesting to see if those negotiations shake out, because they didn't quite make it over the finish line this time.
Okay, well, another sort of historic piece of legislation that went through in lame duck, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation will get a 1,500-acre state park, the Shabana Lake and State Park in DeKalb County. That park was named after a former chief of the Prairie Band Potawatomi who used to have a reservation until it was illegally sold out from under them in 1850. So for about the last 175 years, the Prairie Band Potawatomi have been talking about and trying to get their reservation back in Illinois, and it looks like that is now about to happen, assuming that Governor J.B. Pritzker signs that piece of legislation. Probably also worth mentioning, one bill that did not get through the lame duck session that stirred a lot of controversy along the way would have put new regulations on the industrial hemp industry, including products made with what's called hemp-derived THC, products that are currently unregulated. So we are going to look forward to seeing more of that in the regular session as that issue is not about to die down. You can read more about all of these stories at capitalnewsillinois.com. But now I'd like to turn to the inauguration of the 104th General Assembly, which took place on Wednesday. Our PAR interns, Bridgette Fox and Jade Aubrey, were there. Bridgette, let's start with you. You were in the Senate ceremonies. Why don't you talk a little bit about what happens during an inauguration and kind of what were your impressions overall of that ceremony?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So the inauguration, when we walked in, it'd been the first time journalists had been let in there for about 2.5 years, and most of the senators as well. So there was a new skylight. Well, I think technically it's not even a skylight because there's a little floor in between, but the stained glass is there, renovated. Although the switchboards that were supposed to be set up that shows all the senators' votings, during the next day of session, we saw that they weren't working, which was a disappointment to some of the people there. But there was definitely a sense of cordialness through all the senators. Everyone in their speeches mentioned something about being kind and working with each other. Deputy Minority Leader Sue Resin even teased and joked about both Don Harmon and John Curran being boring but good leaders for each of their parties, respectively. So definitely in contrast to what I heard about the House.
Yeah, the Senate has always been considered a little more stately, a little more ceremonial, certainly more courtly in their demeanor. That's not always the case in the House, which can be a little more rambunctious. Jade, you and I were both over at the House ceremony at the UIS campus in Springfield. Had a little bit of a different tone to it than the Senate ceremony. What were your impressions overall?
Yeah, the House inauguration was tense and loud, and it elicited a lot of reactions from the crowd. Speaker Welch's speech really was kind of a call to action to both House Democrats and Illinois Democrats to rise to the occasion and, as he said, respond to the pressure of today's political climate. McCombie's speech was quite the opposite.
That's Tony McCombie, who's the House Republican leader.
Yes. She kind of went in on House Democrats and said that when she was first appointed to Minority Leader 2 years ago, she had a very naive and optimistic attitude that they would work with House Republicans and have them have a seat at their table. She made reference to the fact that that did not happen and said that this year she was not asking for them to let her have a seat at their table, but instead was offering them a seat at her table. So it got a little tense in there. The crowd at times with Speaker Welch was on their feet. They were yelling, they were clapping, they were responding very positively back. When McCombie spoke, it was the opposite. There were boos, there was really heavy silence. And when I walked out, I had this feeling of tension, for sure.
Okay. Well, Jade and Bridgette, thank you very much for helping cover those events, and we will look forward to more of your reporting as the session goes on. In the meantime, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation with significant funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, this is Peter Hancock on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team saying thank you for listening.